Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so grateful to have an opportunity to speak about language access and our work together as parent centers and working for systems change. We're coming to you from Washington State, from the Parent Training and Information Center. Jen Cole is with Partnerships for Action, Voices for Empowerment, and Jen will introduce herself on her own shortly. And then my name is Joy Sebe, and I am with Open Doors for Multicultural Families and Advocacy and Civic Engagement Program Manager, and also the Director of the Community Parent Resource Center. Jen, can you move us to the next? All right, well, we just wanted to kind of give time to tell you all who we are. Jen and I are, we got together and knew each other first as, representatives of our organizations, but have grown pretty close over the years, or, months and years, to kind of get to know each other's children, our families. And so we also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce ourselves to you. My name is Joy, and I am pictured with one of my children, Nathan, in the bottom. And we are really right here with you in terms of navigating virtual learning. I have two children with IEPs. One's a 5th grader, another one's an 8th grader, and we had a challenging morning, but we're going to get through this together. So thank you very much. And Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Hi, I'm Jen Cole, and I am in the Everett area, which is a little bit north of Seattle. And my son currently is in school right now on his own device, accessing specially designed instruction in math. So we'll see how this goes. And yeah, as Joy was saying, I'm just really happy to be joining you today as we're all in this together. And, Joy, both Joy and I, we are children of immigrants ourselves. And so I think, there are things that drew us together in this work around our lived experience, supporting our families, of course. And then we also know that as parent centers, we also have a deep concern for making sure that all families understand their rights to a free and appropriate public education. So thank you for joining us today. This is great.
Thank you, Jen. And we also recognize that change takes time, and it requires partnerships and relationships across all levels. And so I think Jen and I'll speak for myself, but I'm certainly very grateful to have all of the partners in Washington State, and then shared values and friendship with Jen Cole here. So we're just going to be talking to you. Jen, if you can move to the next. We'll be talking to you today about, we've just divided our talk into 2 sections with a break in between, because we really want people to have the opportunity to move their bodies and just take a break and process information. So the first section will be 30 minutes and not 40, and I'll focus on what is language access and why is it important? How can parent centers partner, with examples with how Open Doors for Multicultural Families and PAVE have partnered, our ongoing journey toward language access, and we're going to intersperse that with polls, because in this virtual space, we really have to make use of what tools that we have in order to interact with you all. We would love to be able to kind of talk to you in person, but we're gonna work with the technological tools that we have. And then we'll break for 10 minutes, and that could be an opportunity if you have questions we'll field questions in that time and then come back together for part 2, and Jen will take it from there and talk about strategies for improving language access for families. Next, please. All right, so first, before we talk about language access, I wanted to set aside time to define it. So what is language access? In schools in particular, it's meaningful two-way communication between families and students and school staff. So that really kind of breaks down into two forms of communication. So that's qualified interpreters in all conversations with school staff, all conversations, and then translations of vital documents. Language access is protected by state and federal law, including IDEA, and it includes blind and visually impaired and deaf and hard of hearing and deaf-blind students and families. And we really want to emphasize this because when folks talk about language access, we kind of default to thinking about spoken language, about immigrants and refugees, but there are certainly families who have communication disabilities and or are immigrants and refugees. So there's a lot of intersectionality in our work. Next, please. Okay, now why is language access important? Within Washington State alone, 1 in 7 Washington State residents are immigrants or refugees. And to become proficient in English, you need 9 years of formal education, but many families are busy working. I know that, for example, my family growing up, we spent a lot of time with the Japanese and Japanese American communities as well. It's a place of comfort and just community building. So families really need a means to both celebrate their cultures and also communicate. Language access is really the first step to enable communication. And so we recognize that families really can't advocate for their children if they can't first communicate. And so what is happening now in Washington State, and I would assume that this is happening really across the country, given the state of language access in our schools. A lot of families, when they ask for an interpreter or translation, they are denied the request. If they do have an interpreter come in, even with the interpreter's best intent, the interpreters aren't really qualified and knowledgeable in the language of education, in the language of disability and special education. And so they're not able to provide accurate information. There are many schools who provide school staff as interpreters. And so there's that conflict of interest there. And so a lot of families feel intimidated when interpreters who work at the schools and really report to the school admin are interpreting for their children. And then that often for us leads to students interpreting at their own meetings. And you can just imagine how troubling that is if a student has to communicate the challenges that they're having, communicate for the first time. Maybe a parent may be hearing about something that had happened and the student is responsible for finding a way to communicate that to their parent or family member in that meeting. So clearly there's a need for better language access. Next, please. All right, so there's a whole host of conversations that require language access. And so these are just 3 examples. And the conversations can go from just everyday communications and conversations with school staff, and then it could also include more high stakes meetings such as IEP meetings, discipline, or truancy meetings. So the first example is a deaf parent of a hearing child needs to communicate with their school because her child got hurt at recess and the parent wants to know what happened. During virtual learning, it could be that the deaf parent needs to figure out what instruction the child needs and just help navigate that process for their child. Second, it could be a parent who doesn't speak English and has a question for the office staff about school forms, or it could also be a parent who needs the school forms that are mandatory to be provided in their native language. And then third, a parent may speak conversational English, but has difficulty in understanding the technical language of the special education system and really needs an interpreter to understand and make the right decisions in an IEP meeting. This could also include a parent who does not speak English and also needs an interpreter in those meetings. Next, please. All right, so I said that we would kind of try to integrate some of these polls in our conversations. And so the first poll, and I think it'll pop up for you, is what percentage of the families you serve require language access in school meetings? Is it 0 to 25%, 25 to 50%, more than 50%, or you're not quite sure? And so this is just kind of for us to get a gauge of the type of families you're working with. Okay, I'm just going to give you a moment to fill that out.
Okay, Joy, it looks like we have folks taking the poll right now. Just give it a couple more minutes. It looks like we're approaching 80% of folks participating in the poll.
Thanks, Jen. I can actually see the poll.
There, good. Okay. All right, Joy, I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and end the poll, and so we could see the results. Here we go.
Great, thank you.
All right.
All right. So do you see the poll results, Jen?
I do.
Okay, all right, great. So it looks like it's very helpful for us to know. It looks like about 50% of us have families serve about 0 to 25% of families who require language access in school meetings. And so that really does help us kind of, figure out what types of information may be helpful for you in terms of strategies that would be helpful in helping families communicate. And then about 20% of you all serve 25 to 50% or more than 50%. So thank you so much. All right, we're gonna kind of move on to the next slide. All right, so this is just a snapshot of the families served by where I am at Open Doors for Multicultural Families. And so on the left-hand side, there's a pie chart showing the breakdown of languages in which we provided direct support in 2019. And so this is primarily by our bilingual and bicultural staff. And you can see that that 19% of our families speak English, and the majority of our English-speaking clients are African American. And then after that section, the primary languages spoken by our clients and for which they receive direct support are Spanish, Somali, Vietnamese, and that's kind of followed up with Mandarin, Korean, Cantonese, Arabic, Amharic, Tigrinya, and Khmer. And then there's there's a host of other languages. And so just to provide a frame of reference, at least 72% of the families we serve are provided direct support in a language other than English. And so we've kind of prioritized language access as a policy and advocacy priority because we've heard from the majority of our families that they're having difficulty communicating with schools in their native language. Next, please. All right, so next, how can parent centers partner to address inequities? Really, it started for Jen and I, at least, in terms of laying the foundation. And so we started as, a professional relationship, and then over time we realized with our shared values and mutual respect that we have also become friends. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be friends without the parent center leaders that you partner with, but it certainly does help. And then I'd just like to share 3 ways in which we've worked together on addressing inequities. And the first one is to work strategically and be unified, particularly as it relates to the meetings and the places we're going to. And so it's helpful to kind of have a conversation, either informal or formally, to kind of list out what the connections each parent centers have. Maybe it helps to create an asset map or just a list of, oh, I go here, you go there, okay. And then what's our unified messaging going to be in all of these places as it relates to serving students with disabilities or advocacy priority. So for example, Jen and I both serve on the State Special Education Advisory Council, but we also serve in different coalitions and work groups. For example, Jen serves on the State Sexual Health and Education Work Group, and so she can provide information to me about the progress of that work group while also communicating out the ODMF experience and priorities there. I serve on a coalition in Washington State for legislative change for students with disabilities, and can really lift up language access and our policy priorities there as well. And then PAVE and ODMF also have a monthly meeting with staff in our state education agency offices of special education, equity, and civil rights, and maybe a growing list to really examine the dispute resolution process so that it is accessible and that there's a means for us to provide information to our state education agency about the problems and barriers that families are experiencing, including in accessing the dispute resolution process. Next slide. All right. We've also partnered together quite a bit on presentations and panels and joint letters. For example, presentations and panels. Jen hosted a panel on language access at the annual Washington State Coalition for Language Access Summit. She kind of used her privilege there to lift up language access and invited me and representatives from the State Education Agency, our Office of Education Ombuds, to speak on progress on language access. And then we've also worked on some joint letters between PAVE, ODMF, and another organization, Roots of Inclusion, to submit a joint letter to a statewide committee that's dedicated to addressing opportunity gaps for students of color. And in that case, to really highlight the stories of students of color with disabilities, and to make sure that recommendations for school reopening are not siloed, but really thinking about our students furthest from educational opportunity. Next slide, please. Okay, and so third, we can bring together self-advocates and parents and caregivers to share their stories. And so on the right-hand side, and also behind me in my background, you see a picture of some of the open doors for multicultural families, self-advocates who went through our leadership and advocacy training, and they're prepared signs as we headed into our legislative forum for developmental disabilities that they attended. And so we really see that there's this evolution of empowerment. For example, if we look at our parent support groups, that families are coming together first to seek support from one another and to share resources and information, and then realize that as they come together that their challenges are really common and due to systemic barriers. Building the knowledge and skills at that point to advocate becomes necessary, as they think, oh, well, this isn't just me, it's the system. What can we do to address systemic barriers? And then once they build their leadership capacity, that they can train other self-advocates and parents and kind of light the beacons and leaders within our communities. Next, please. All right, so then that kind of brings us to our second poll, is how have you partnered with other parent centers to address inequity? And it could include meetings, joint efforts like presentations or letters, building student and family leadership, and providing opportunities for civic engagement, or anything else that you can think of.
So it looks like folks are just starting to take the poll right now. We're approaching about 40% of participants responding.
Thank you, Jen. It's always exciting to kind of see what's going on in other places. And so I appreciate you all taking the time to fill out this poll.
Yes, and you know, for participants, they surely could provide additional information in the chat if they would like. You know, if they have some things that worked really well in their respective areas, we could definitely share that out through chat, because we're all resources onto one another. And Washington State is one story of parent centers working together, for sure. Okay.
Yes,
so
definitely.
It looks like, looks like a little bit more than half of individuals have voted. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds, then I'll go ahead and end the poll and then share the results.
Yeah, and if you, just as Jen said, if you have any examples or thoughts to share on your partnerships, we would love to hear about them in the chat as well. All right, it looks like Jen has shared the poll results, and we have a lot of work and joint efforts in working together, followed by meetings, and then building student and family leadership. And so that's great. Is there, and we'll keep track of the chat as well to see what you all are working on in those arenas. Okay, thank you, Jen. And Jen, if you can move us on to the next one. Okay, so now I'll share a little bit about our ongoing journey for language access. This journey has started long before the study on the left-hand side was published in 2015. But this study, this language access feasibility study that you see on the left-hand side is really the first more tangible product of work on language access. And so in 2015, a study was published on the state of language access in Washington state that included a number of focus groups with families served by Open Doors, and it was required by House Bill 1709. And then there was a group that came together to decide on a Washington State Language Access Plan that was adopted in 2016. And so there's just kind of an image of that here, but you know, this is a long road. So just because there's a plan in place and paper doesn't mean that families are still have reliable access to information. And so we've still, you know, students are still interpreting at their own IEP meetings. Families, we just checked in with families last week, and that there are still a lot of common issues across cultures that families are having with language access. And so that just verifies for us the importance of this issue. Next slide, please. All right, so we then want to talk to you about Engrossed, this House bill that helped us in 2019 make a little bit more progress on language access. And it mandated the formation of a language access work group to make policy recommendations on how interpreters and translations can be provided to families reliably and with high quality. We're wrapping up a year of meeting together with some really expert work group members and are reporting to the legislature in October 2020, so this month. And then it also mandated that school staff document when qualified interpreters are provided for school meetings. At the time when we drafted this section of the bill, we didn't realize that school staff in Washington state are already required to document this. What is necessary is that the data needs to be acquired kind of consistently and then reported back, right? So there's that connection of collecting the data and then who will hold folks accountable for the data that was collected. And so this has been really a learning process for us. Next slide. All right, so it,
Joy?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, Joy. I was just going to say, as before you start up again, if anybody from a different state, if your state actually captures the data more than just is a interpreter required, but actually captures that one was provided for those types of meetings, that would be interesting to hear about it. And if you have it, like in the chat, if you wanted to provide your state, we'd love to know about that. But sorry, Joy, that just popped in my mind.
Yeah, we would love to hear what's happening in other states so that we can kind of work together and figure out how to do better. So any information that you have would be really much appreciated. But while you're doing that, I'll just kind of keep on going and talk about kind of like a photographic journey of this House Bill 1130 during the 2019 legislative session. There was, it was sponsored by a representative in the House, in this state House of Representatives, and then there was a companion bill in the Senate. And so that's kind of it. There's a good indication that there was support across the two, the branches there within the legislature. It received strong support and then increasing support from members of the Legislators of Color Caucus. And then on the left-hand side, there is an image of Jen and her son Gabriel testifying in support of 1130 within the House Education Committee. And so it was just a really beautiful picture of Gabriel smiling. And he was adorable. He stole the show. And then in the middle, as the bill moved through the House and then went into the Senate, this is a picture of me with a group of ODMF mothers and an infant, and then Joanna Ramos, a fellow community leader, testifying after we testified in the Senate Education Committee. And so that was really an experience for our parent advocates as and it was interesting because they required an interpreter in Cantonese, but the interpreter we got didn't really understand Cantonese. It was more of a Vietnamese interpreter. So that was also interesting to see the barriers for civic engagement within our legislature. And then on the right-hand side, we have a picture of Representative Orwell and Senator Wellman after the bill passed. And it was just, taken right after. They sent it along as a selfie. So next slide, please. And then this is just a nice colorful photo here of many of us from not just Open Doors, but a lot of the folks who worked alongside us and with us to help pass this bill, which is really just the beginning, again, of a journey to provide policy recommendations to implement language access. But it's a nice moment to celebrate as progress with so many smiling, diverse faces. And so next slide. And so the work group has been meeting, this language access work group has been meeting for now more than a year, and we're finishing up our final recommendations, but this is a picture of our first work group meeting on the left-hand side. And then the work group has diverse representation and expertise, and so that includes people with disabilities who experience language access barriers, the representatives from the Washington State School for the Blind, the Washington State Center for Childhood Deafness and Hearing Loss, families who've experienced language access barriers, community-based organizations that support students and families, interpreters working in education settings, in interpreter unions, and then educators and para-educators. Next, please. Right, and now the final recommendations are coming in October. What's been really wonderful to see is that the Language Access Work Group is modeling language access by working with American Sign Language and spoken language interpreters in a remote setting. And the final draft recommendations will be ready October 15th. It's coming up with a long list of recommendations on family engagement, on a toolkit for supporting communication between families and school staff, includes standards for interpreters working in education settings, the data that needs to be collected and how it should be reported, identifying best practices for remote interpreting, and then the necessary staffing at the school, local education agency, and state education agency levels that are necessary to coordinate language access and monitor the data and really hold schools accountable for doing better. All right, next please. All right, so now we're kind of in our third poll here, and we're just curious, are there efforts in your state that you know of to advance educational language access policies? And it's possible that you all are doing some work in this area, or that you know of work. And it's also possible that you're not quite sure, but we'd like to know either way. So I see that Johan has started the poll. So we have about 65% have voted, and we have a lot of people who make sense or not quite sure if there are language access policies in your state, and that's very helpful to know. All right, so now we're at 76% in our polling. And I think, Jen, we can kind of wrap up the polling now, and it shows that, we're not quite sure if there are language access policies that are being advanced in our states, and then there are also, some of you have also said that there are language access policies that are advancing. So we would love to hear in the chat what you know about that and which states those are. And then if you're willing to drop your contact info, we can reach out to you. Oh, okay, we have Jerry Clark from PAVE in Washington State. Thank you. Any other folks know about educational language access policies in your state? Arkansas Department of Education, Elizabeth says that backs a new state educational interpreter certification developed by Partners for Inclusive Communities. It's very exciting elevation of educational interpreters in Arkansas. Thank you very much for sharing, Elizabeth. That's helpful to know. All right. And if you all have any policies that you're advancing, we would love to kind of get in contact with you to see how we can support one another on this issue. All right, Jen, if you can move us to the next slide. All right, now it's break time for 10. We have break time scheduled for 10 minutes, Jen. Is 10 minutes okay, or did you want to change it to any other time?
Well, I was wondering, Joy, if maybe 5 minutes would be okay, because you and I will continue to be here in this virtual space if anybody has questions for this first part, but I imagine there might be some questions at the end too. So if we just have it maybe a shorter break and just a little bit of time at the end to chat, that might work. So for 5 minutes, I'll set my timer. you know, folks, you're more than welcome to, you know, get up and stretch. I know I've been on Zoom all day with my son. Likely many others have also. So 5-minute break, and Joy and I are in the virtual space. If you want to share any information, ask any questions about the first half of the presentation, that would be great. I've set a timer, so 5 minutes actually.
Thank you, Jen. I think a lot of us are undergoing some Zoom exhaustion.
Yes, I know at the end of the week, my son and myself included, I mean, we're just really exhausted, you know, more so than pre-COVID. You know, the amount of energy it takes to attend to things virtually is immense, I'm finding. I don't know about you, Joy, but yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that the Zoom setting seems to default to back-to-back meetings, right? 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. And no matter how much we try to end early and give that 5-minute buffer, it's really just nonstop processing. And so there's a real need to reflect that is difficult to build in given the level of the workload.
Joy and Jen, there was a post in the chat that, oh, okay, you saw it, Jen. Good deal.
Yes, absolutely. Elizabeth had a question, Joy. I think
I think Johan, yeah, Elizabeth, if you want to write it, we would love a question. I think Johan does need to unmute you though.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, this is wonderful. This is my favorite area. I was able to participate in the educational certification that we have here in Arkansas last year and certify, and it's wonderful. And they work in collaboration with SESO Inc., SESO, with Anna Soler, and they've done a wonderful job of having a respectful and inclusive project. It's really interesting, and they've got a great resource, a huge interpreter clearinghouse. Are you all familiar with it? SESO Inc. SESO, Inc. And it's a lot of tools for educational interpreters that you might find very interesting. My question very quickly was, you know, we've really noticed, in spite of, you know, that program that has started and it's really new, that conflict of interest of building level interpreters, and it's such a challenge. The resources are so limited to schools, and often there's, you know, such a limited, maybe no one in the building all the time who speaks Spanish, for example, or only 3 days a week, or so if there's a problem, you know, there's a challenge. And then also just that conflict of interest is so hard for parents, and they are intimidated and they don't. So I just didn't know if you had maybe some insight into your work with that situation.
Yeah, that's such a common issue. And there are some ways in which we circumvent that is some of the ways is that if we our case managers and direct support staff will meet with families with language line with the remote interpreter on the line in advance, just to plan for the meeting. Like what do you want to really, what are our goals for the meeting and what do we want to get out of it? And so that what do we do if there's they don't have an interpreter, and then if they pull in an interpreter who's a school staff, do we request, is our option to request for a phone interpreter in that time, or do we ask to cancel the meeting? So it has been, helpful for the families and the staff in our parent center to have a plan of action to anticipate that. But that certainly is really a common challenge.
Just a quick additional question. When you're in that situation, are you finding that you're able to do any collaboration with the school district itself to kind of plan ahead for that, or how is that working for you?
Right, yeah. So I think the other part of that is for the school districts, for us as a parent center to reach out to the school district and let them know, hey, this is a problem we've been having. If the problem continues, then to reach out to our state education agency and kind of have them come alongside and support us to figure out, because it's not just a problem with really one school or one district. And so there's a level of like relationship building, but then a level of oversight as well that kind of needs to happen so that school staff are really hearing from the district that it's necessary and what supports they need in order to make it happen. But it's challenging, and it's, as you know, it's individualized for each personal situation and the relationships and dynamics that are at play. Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that question. It's certainly a work in progress. All right, Jen, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Joy. And yes, thank you for raising those issues. I think that something that we're looking at in Washington State with the recommendations includes things like a code of ethics. I mean, is that incorporated in the bigger vision of interpreting for educational settings? And right now it is in our state such a patchwork quilt of what each district is doing in terms of that. The guidance that they've had so far has been pretty loose, and so you can have situations where somebody who's working as an instructional aide or a paraeducator is just pulled from a classroom to just come and talk to a parent and they haven't had any training on interpreting. And so when that was just a really interesting thing when our work group convened, and we heard from professionals who this is their livelihood. They interpret for courts, they interpret in medical settings, other settings where the standards are pretty high. I mean, because really, in a court setting, a medical setting, it could mean life or death, really. So can we have and extend that conversation into our educational settings to know that at the core, our students, our families have rights, and especially as it intersects with entitlements under the IDEA, it's really important that they have more information about interpreting, and they have access to terminology that helps them do it effectively for families. So we'll just go ahead and pick up with our journey of Washington State. So the first part, Joy kind of just laid out what our journey has been as two parent centers and in partnership with community-based organizations, with other families, with people who really care about this issue. And I think in the bigger conversation of a parent training and information center that PAVE serves the entire state of Washington, it was an opportunity for us to even reflect on our own language access plan. We definitely have room to grow in that area. And with technology and with some of our interpreting companies advancing in what they're able to offer, it's become even more accessible for our organization to access interpreters. I think one of the things we did last year is we got an app. I mean, there's an app for that. You can have an app on your phone that can do video interpreting, and you're working with a parent, and you can connect the dots that way. And so it just helps everybody when we all provide language access in a very professional and meaningful way for families. It's not the work of just open doors for multicultural families to do it. I mean, we have to be doing it all together. So in part two, to just close us out, I'm going to talk about strategies for improving language access for families. And really, this is based on three things. So knowing for ourselves what our families' rights to language access, and then how do we do this in a meaningful way as we provide direct support to families. And then what are the tools for families in schools that not only as a parent center that we could utilize, but then we can also share out in our collaborative relationships with schools and for families. So again, it's circling back to what is our own knowledge as an organization about our families' rights to language access. So, this is covered under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And at its core, it's prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So that not only extends to our state education agency, to our schools, but it does extend to us as parent centers as we're accessing grants through the U.S. Department of Education to do the work. And then Executive Order 13166, improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. So this is out of 2000. Each federal agency shall examine the services it provides and develop and implement a system by which LEP persons or limited English proficient persons can meaningfully access those services. So again, that was just our reflection as PAVE when we looked at our language access plan, that we definitely had room to grow. And this is the bigger conversation for United States, or for our state, in terms of their own language access plans. We know that in Washington, many schools had them, but was it even working? Nobody was evaluating that, if it was sufficient enough. And then, of course, with the IDEA, that families do have rights to access meaningful information so they could understand what is happening, what are the rights of their student, and how to access procedural safeguards. So, again, circling back to the IDEA, which, as parent centers, we're focused on, the right to be evaluated in their native language, the right to an interpreter in IEP meetings, the right to prior written notice in their native language, and the procedural safeguards in their native language are core pieces of setting up any family where English is not their first language to have success in advocating for their children, for sure. And I see Elizabeth is sharing resources in the box. Oh, Elizabeth, thank you. So appreciate that. All right, and then, additionally, the right to be evaluated in their native language. So some additional details of that. So, it's so crucial. Those evaluations form the basis for eligibility and the services thereof. So, um, you know, in their native language, so it's able to yield the accurate information that is needed. So, teams know how to plan for that child's education. And then also the right to interpreter in an IEP meeting, meaningful parent participation. That the public agency must take whatever action is necessary to ensure that the parent understands the proceedings of the IEPT meeting, including arranging an interpreter for parents with a deafness or whose native language is other than English. So I think, like, for Washington State, our work group really expanded our awareness about communication disability and how that shows up for families with a communication disability. And in our many work group meetings that were available to the public, it was amazing to see how interpreters for participants who were deaf or hard of hearing, participants who spoke other languages, all came together. And when COVID hit, it was a huge shift to go virtual and provide all of that interpretation online and live. I give credit to our state education agency for pulling that together. And we did actually have a meeting that had to be canceled because we couldn't access interpreters. So it's a big lift, but I think if I'm just reflecting on it, when we know when COVID hit and school facilities shut down, there was such a huge gap for families who did not speak English to understand what was going on, how to access resources, and that was across the board, not just families who had children eligible for special education. So, definitely we have an opportunity to correct course and implement some good guidance and make recommendations that are really going to get to equity for our families and communities more broadly. And again, with the IDEA, prior written notice in their native language, so that those PWNs, as they're also known, and I know they have other names in other states for those, that they're in the language that the family speaks, that they prefer to communicate in. And that was another learning for me, is that a family doesn't have to prove, right, that they need this interpretation. It's really like if they ask for it, then they need it. It needs to be given to them. And right to procedural safeguards in the native language. So, explaining a full explanation of the procedural safeguards written in the native language of the parents. And there's that parentheses, like, unless it's clearly not feasible to do so. Like, we had a lot of conversations in our work group about, well, what does that mean? I mean, who gets to determine with the lens of equity what's feasible and what's not? And written in an easily understandable manner, for sure. That's an important part of language access. And as I reflect, as for our own parent center, it was really important for us to pay attention to that we write our guidance, our documents, our materials that are designed for families in a way that it could be easily understood, and at a reading level that's accessible to most people, right? So there's that. And so we have another poll for you coming up. Which of the following are consistently provided in your state? So there's 4 options: evaluations in native language, interpreter in IEP meetings, prior written notice in the native language or procedural safeguards in native language in an understandable manner. So if you're aware if it's happening consistently, which ones, and you can choose more than one for sure.
Jen, and I realized in this I didn't provide an option of none of the above.
Yes. So if you feel that way, you could definitely put that in the chat for sure. Like, that's not happen in our state consistently. Okay. So it looks like we have about 40% participating. I'll go ahead and share those results. Okay. So there's awareness about evaluations happening in the native language, interpreters being provided, about 50%, prior written notice, a little less than that, and procedural safeguards in an understandable manner. That seems to be one that's more of the known. I know in our state education agency has multiple languages posted for procedural safeguards. And I think they just added in this past year, like some more languages. So that was really a great thing that they did. And I'm just noticing, yes, so not so much, not any of the above, only when parents request. That's a slippery one, isn't it? And noticing that changes from district to district for sure. We have over 295 districts in Washington state. They all operate under local control. So we see inconsistencies all over the place. And that's, I think, one thing we're hopeful for Washington and with this work group and the recommendations that are going to come out is that we'll get more consistency ultimately. Because families don't typically just stay in one place forever. Okay, I'll just go ahead and close that poll and stop sharing results. All right. So direct support for families. So if we're thinking about it through the lens of parent centers, there's a number of ways we can accomplish this and improve our services. And definitely we are part of a movement to help families have better collaborative relationships with their schools, to help families know what their rights are. So we need to be sharing that information. And then also, can we provide opportunities to check in with families that interpreters were provided in their meetings? Sometimes we're not attending meetings with families to know if that actually happened. But do we have a way to know that if it did? I think as far as PAVE goes, we were looking at our database. We use Salesforce, and I know like many parent centers do. Like, is there a way that we can start collecting data on that in a meaningful way for families we support in meetings that an interpreter was provided or was not provided? And on this slide, you'll see an example of a blog post that Joy wrote about addressing opportunity gaps for youth of color with disabilities, serving as a liaison between families and schools. So, the more that we talk about it, the more that we bring it into our bigger conversations. Like Joy mentioned, we both serve on our state advisory panel, or in Washington known as the Special Education Advisory Council. Do we prioritize this as one of the topics that we can speak about on a consistent basis? Definitely help. Oops, I think okay. And then, so here are some examples of some tools for families and schools that we can definitely be agencies in the mix to share. So, a card for families to say what language they speak and to request an interpreter, creating flyers for families explaining their rights, helping families plan for their meetings. So Open Doors for Multicultural Families has a nice checklist for schools to learn how to work with interpreters. I have been myself in meetings where I, really just stopped the meeting to really kind of slow it down and talk about some ways that we could implement some tools to work more effectively with an interpreter, and schools have been open to that. And then also, getting feedback on the meetings themselves. And Open Doors also has an evaluation form for families to provide feedback on the quality of the interpreters too. It's all a feedback loop that helps inform the system to do better, for sure. So this next slide is an example that is housed on the Washington State Coalition for Language Access website. It's an example of an I Speak card, and it's a downloadable card that gives some language about how to request an interpreter, and then on the back, language access rights for the family that they could carry with them, have available for them for their use. Okay, and again, here are some examples on the slide of Know Your Rights flyers, and this also appears again on the Washington State Coalition for Language Access website. And our state education agency also does have some of these flyers as well, which I appreciate. All right, and I'm just doing a little time check. I know we're getting towards the end here. Again, this is the example that I mentioned, Tools for Families Checklist for schools and families. So a description of what the school can do before, during, and after the IEP meeting to support the family. And we can, as parent centers, apply similar principles for sure. Yeah. And here is an example of the interpreter evaluation form for families. And I really like this form. At the top going across, it says, please rate the following, and it has images of smiley faces going from a very big smile to maybe a very sad smile to kind of indicate the quality. And then that includes things from the speed of the conversation to overall impression of the meeting. So free tools available. And so that brings us to, this might be our last poll, one of our last polls. Which tools do you think could be helpful for your parent center? And those are your choices going back to the I Speak card, the Language Access Rights flyer, checklist, and interpreter evaluation for families. We have that last poll. Maybe. Popping up. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Well, okay, there it is. Thank you. That was Johan. Yay. All right, so here you go. What could be helpful for your parent center that you could take home today? So check out today and start incorporating in some of your practices. And maybe you are already doing these things, and that would also be quite fabulous. Or you have ideas. Feel free to drop them in the chat too. We are a community of learners here. All right, so we're approaching 60% of you all voting, and it's starting to stall out here. So okay, all right, a couple more voting. Yes, I think, any of these and all of these would be helpful to improve our services for families where English is not their first language. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that and share the results for you. All right, yeah. Cards, the evaluation. I think the evaluation one is something that folks probably don't think about as much. Yeah. All right. So I think I just got a couple more slides. And then, all right, so in summary, and this is my son, Gabriel, if you can see the video, he's popping in here, his class is done. Language access is the first step to communication. So as a beginning point, you know, how are we going to be able to serve families? How are families going to know their rights if we can't communicate, if we don't do better? And then we can all partner in a range of ways, including advocating for systems change. So in Washington State, working with Joy has been just an amazing experience, and it makes the collaboration stronger. It expands our networks. It makes us better, for sure. And it's all intersectional issues for families where English is not their first language. So federal and state laws protect family right to information in their native language, and we have tools and support available right now to improve our services, to get helpful information from families about what is working and what is not working. We definitely play a critical role in helping families communicate with schools. And then that brings us to almost the close of our session, and it brings us to our many thank yous to all of you who came and joined us today. Appreciate your time and attention to this really important subject. It's so important. You did it.
Hi, Gabriel and Jen. I can close us. So thank you, everyone. Our emails are on the slide, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We appreciate it. And Terry says, please remember to complete the session feedback. Yes, we would love all of your feedback. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, ladies. We really appreciate the information that you provided to us today. And everyone for attending today. Appreciate your attention. If there are any last words or last questions, I think we might have a minute.
Yeah, I would just say, please feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in knowing more about what's happening in Washington State and what could happen maybe in your state. And then also, you know, I'm hoping to revisit this issue next year for sure. Like, if we have more parent centers across the nation working on this very important issue, I could see how we could really move the needle for our families where English is not their first language, or they have a communication disability.